Hello, welcome. Today we're gonna shift gears a little bit. We're gonna switch. We're gonna take a look at some writings about Americans, the ways in which Americans have been written about. And the first text is called The Xenophobe's Guide to the Americans. Xenophobe definition, I'm sure you know, is someone with a disdain or a prejudice against people from a different country. And so today's text, it's part of a larger sort of project. There are many of these books, The Xenophobe's Guide to the Germans, you have The Xenophobe's Guide to Spaniards. There are many of these, and they're meant to be kind of playful, some jokes in there, maybe a little bit of truth. But it starts with this great quote, this great sort of swing at Americans. And it says, Americans are like teenagers. They're noisy, curious, unable to keep a secret, not given to subtlety, and prone to misbehave in public. And it says, once we understand this, once we realize that Americans are pretty much just basically an adolescent, the rest of the culture kind of falls into place. There's a cheerfulness with Americans. The text gets into this, the cheerfulness. But the flip side is that there's an undercurrent of insecurity and depression. It talks about how we're driven by fear. As Americans, we think about, if we're single, we worry about getting married. If we're married, we worry about getting a divorce. And if we're divorced again, we worry that we'll never meet somebody who's attractive ever again. So we're driven by this fear. Think about Ring by Spring, this awful, awful thing that you've all heard of or seen, this terrible thing. You need to somehow find a partner by spring and specify which spring. I imagine it's your senior year. But you should, incidentally, on a side note, you should not get married until you're 30 years old, at least. But these are the kinds of things that are in our culture, right? The fear, we're driven by fear. If you don't meet somebody in college, when else are we going to meet somebody? The text gets into the American obsession with money. We're so obsessed with money, and we're very open about it. Time isn't money, necessarily. Everything is money. And it talks about how Americans are quite open about how much money they make, about how much something costs. How much did your divorce lawyer cost? Oh, mine was half as much, etc. The obsession with money reminds me of a great quote by Kurt Vonnegut, one of my absolute favorite authors. This is another side note. But he says this in Slaughterhouse-Five. He says, America is the wealthiest nation on earth, but its people are mainly poor, and poor Americans are urged to hate themselves. It is, in fact, a crime for an American to be poor, even though America is a nation of poor. Every other nation has full traditions of men who were poor, but extremely wise and virtuous, and therefore more estimable than anyone with power and gold. No such tales are told by the American poor. They mock themselves and glorify their betters. A little bit further down, he concludes with this. Many novelties have come from America. The most startling of these, a thing without precedent, is a mass of undignified poor. They do not love one another because they do not love themselves. And this, of course, reminds me of a quote that's often attributed to John Steinbeck, although there's some question as to whether he said it or if it's more of a paraphrase. But Ronald Wright writes in his book, and he says this, Socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Now, maybe that rings true, maybe it doesn't ring true, but it gets back to the way that Americans think about money if we go back to the text that we're reading for this week. Maybe some of this you read and thought, this is absolutely ridiculous, this is a caricature. Maybe you recognize some things in yourself. Maybe you recognize some things in your friends or your family, but I hope that at some level it was fun as well. And also important for me that you could see how, what it feels like to be written about in this way. Okay, and we turn now to the second text, this really short article that was published in 1956. So very old, but I think very interesting and important. It was written by Horace Minor, and it's called Body Rituals Among the Nasarima. And I love the way it starts. It talks, we're going to talk about this culture. And it says this, the culture of these people is still very poorly understood. Now pay attention to the perspective. Understood by whom? We are the ones who need to do the understanding, and it's not very well understood. But of course, for the Nasarima, it is very well understood. The text gets into shrines in the household, charm boxes with magical materials specific for certain illnesses. It talks about the ritual of the mouth. The Nasarima are obsessed with the mouth, and they believe that without these rituals, the teeth would fall out, they would decay, the gums would start bleeding, etc. There's another ritual that involves inserting a bundle of hog hair into the mouth with some kind of with magical powers. They also talk about the holy mouth man, the sort of witch doctor, which they go to once or twice per year, sometimes more. And they quote this: "It is hoped that when a thorough study of the Nasarima is made, there will be a careful inquiry into the personality structure of these people." These people referring to these witch doctors, right? They talk about medicine men and their impressive latipso. Latipso, of course, was the place that you would go to with any kind of ailment or disease. And talks about medicine men that come from time to time to jab a magically treated needle into the flesh. And there's another practitioner they talk about, a listener they call him, which is also another witch doctor of sorts. And there are a bunch of other practices that are worth noting. There are fasts to make fat people thin. There are feasts to make thin people fat. And it has this quote that I love: "The ideal form is virtually outside the range of human variation." So there appears to be one human form that is ideal, and all of the Nasarima, they work towards that. It concludes with this thought: "Our review of the ritual life of the Nasarima has certainly shown them to be a magic-ridden people. It is hard to understand how they have managed to exist so long under the burdens which they have imposed upon themselves." You may have recognized from the very beginning, or you may have noticed that they're talking about Americans. Nasarima spelled backwards is American. And even Latipso spelled backwards is hospital, but without the H. But I wonder how you read it. I wonder if you didn't recognize that it was about Americans. What are some of the biases that you held? What are some of the stereotypes? How are you thinking about the different rituals, as they call them, or the witch doctors that we go to on a regular basis? Maybe you don't care. Maybe this doesn't matter. You can say whatever you want to say about me. I don't care. But what if there's certain governments or countries or groups of people who came to visit you and then acted upon these stereotypes and put you and lumped you into these group of people? So once again, I hope that it was kind of a fun, tongue-in-cheek way of looking at ourselves, but also it's important to pay attention to how we write about the other, how we conceive the other.